The millionaire CEO lived for silence and control, until he saw a little girl in a white dress crying alone, and everything he thought he knew shattered in seconds. Adrian Harper had built his life around silence. In his world, everything was orderly, predictable, and quiet. His penthouse on the 42nd floor overlooked the city but never let its noise in, thanks to custom soundproofing. His office was a sanctuary of hushed tones, subtle footsteps, and distant city hum, always muted behind thick glass walls. Even his car drove in silence, gliding through traffic like a shadow. Adrian didn't just prefer silence, he needed it. He believed noise was weakness, that chaos broke focus, and that peace only came when distractions were shut out completely. Children, with their cries, their sticky hands, and their unpredictability, didn't belong in his life. He didn't dislike them out of cruelty, he simply saw them as a different species altogether, wild, emotional, and loud. He had built his empire in that silence, brick by brick, over years of calculated precision and disciplined solitude. That morning, like most others, had been structured perfectly. He woke at 6, worked out in his private gym, reviewed investor reports while sipping a measured cup of espresso, and left his penthouse exactly at 8:15. The only deviation from his usual path was a meeting scheduled by his assistant with a potential partner who insisted on a neutral location, a private corner in a public park near the investor's home. Adrian hated the idea but agreed, knowing the investment was worth the inconvenience. He arrived 10 minutes early, naturally. The park was surprisingly quiet for a weekday morning, the trees just beginning to bloom, birds chirping faintly overhead. He stood near the designated bench, checking his watch, then his phone, already calculating how long he'd tolerate a delay. Then, a sound pierced his carefully constructed peace. At first, it was faint, distant enough to ignore, a soft whimpering sound carried on the breeze. He glanced over his shoulder, annoyed, expecting a dog. But it grew louder. It became a series of choked sobs, high-pitched and unsteady. Adrian exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to walk away. He had no time or patience for interruptions. But the crying didn't stop. In fact, it was getting closer. Reluctantly, almost against his nature, he turned to locate the source. What he saw stopped him cold. A little girl, no more than 3 years old, was sitting on a bench a few yards away, her knees pulled up to her chest, her white dress wrinkled and slightly stained, her matching white sun hat askew. Her small hands rubbed at her eyes, and her face was flushed with tears. Her soft blonde hair peeked out from under the hat in uneven strands. She looked up, as if sensing him, and their eyes met. Brown eyes, deep, wide, and eerily familiar. Adrian stared, frozen, caught off guard not just by the scene, but by the inexplicable pull he felt. She looked like someone. Someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone whose absence had once left a space in his otherwise structured life that he had sealed off and never revisited. He told himself to walk away. The girl would be someone else's problem. A lost child, maybe, or one whose parent was nearby. But she didn't move. No adult came. And then, in a trembling voice that shook something deep inside him, she said, Are you Mr. Harper?" His breath caught. He hadn't told anyone his name in the park. No one knew who he was, he'd made sure of it. Yet here she was, sitting alone, asking for him by name. Adrian stepped closer slowly, pulse beginning to quicken. "Yes," he said cautiously. "Who are you?" The little girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maggie said you might come." That name hit him like a bolt. Maggie. It couldn't be. Maggie had been the best friend, the confidant, the one who stood silently beside Hazel during the months Adrian had tried to forget. The girl looked up again and whispered, "My name's Lily. I'm 3. Then, more softly, "I think you're my dad." In that moment, the world tilted. The silence he had protected for years shattered like glass, not from chaos or disaster, but from the soft, shaking voice of a little girl in white who carried his eyes. Adrian stood motionless, every logical part of his mind scrambling for an explanation while his heart beat unsteadily in his chest. The child in front of him, Lily, was looking up at him with eyes that mirrored his own, and despite the shock running through him, he couldn't deny the striking resemblance. Her voice, soft and hesitant, echoed in his ears, repeating again and again, "I think you're my dad." For a man who had always dismissed emotion as noise and unpredictability as weakness, Adrian found himself suddenly drowning in both. The wind stirred gently through the trees above, and still no one came forward. No frantic parent appeared. It was just her. Just Lily. And she had come expecting him. Before he could respond, a woman hurried across the grass, breathless and clearly distressed. Her coat was misbuttoned, her hair escaping the clip that barely held it in place. The moment she saw Adrian standing next to Lily, she slowed, eyes widening with recognition and anxiety. "Mr. Harper?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Adrian turned toward her, tense, guarded, 100 questions piling up behind his calm exterior. "Yes," he said evenly. "And you are?" She hesitated, glancing between him and the little girl before finally stepping closer. "I'm Maggie. I was Hazel's friend. And Lily's nanny since she was born." At the mention of Hazel's name, 1,000 memories surged forward in Adrian's mind like a sudden flood. Hazel. The woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation. The only person who had ever gotten close enough to unsettle his world. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, hadn't heard her voice, hadn't received so much as a message. And now, here was Maggie, someone tied to that chapter of his life, standing in front of him with the very proof of Hazel's absence wrapped in white lace and tiny trembling fingers. "Where is she?" Adrian asked, though he already knew the answer. Maggie's eyes welled up, and she nodded, swallowing hard. "Hazel passed away. A car accident. Just a few weeks ago. I've been caring for Lily since then, but," she broke off, looking at Lily with pain in her expression. "Before she died, Hazel told me everything. About you. About what happened. And she asked me, if anything ever happened to her, to find you. To bring Lily to you." Adrian's knees felt unstable, but he stood still, forcing composure. It was too much too quickly, Hazel's death, the existence of a daughter he had never known, the sudden responsibility thrust into his arms without warning. He looked down at Lily, who stood silently at his side, her small fingers now gripping the hem of his coat. She hadn't cried again. She was just watching, waiting, as if she instinctively understood that her future depended on this moment. "Why didn't she tell me?" Adrian's voice was quieter now, not cold but weary, aching. "Why didn't she ever say a word?" Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "She wanted to. I think she wrote letters, maybe even tried to call. But Hazel was scared. She thought you'd push her away. She said she didn't want to trap you or ruin your life. So she did what she thought was best. She raised Lily alone. But when she knew her time might be short, she changed her mind. She knew you had a right to know. She told me everything. Hazel trusted you more than you know, even if she never told you directly." Adrian didn't respond right away. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest like stone. His whole life, structured, flawless, built on certainty, had just shifted beneath him. Yet in the middle of that tremor stood a 3-year-old girl with his eyes, watching him not with fear, but with a quiet hopefulness that terrified him more than anything else ever had. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Lily," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "do you want to come with me for a while? Maybe just to get something to eat. Somewhere warm." She nodded without hesitation. "Okay." And just like that, she placed her small hand in his, as if it belonged there all along. As they walked away from the park together, Maggie trailing behind them, Adrian felt a crack forming in the wall he'd built around his life. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, a subtle breaking open. He didn't know what this meant yet. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't even know if he believed he could be. But she was here. Hazel was gone. And this little girl had come into his silence and spoken his name like she'd known him all her life. And somehow, in the middle of all the confusion, Adrian Harper didn't feel lost. He just felt needed. Adrian had never felt so unprepared in his entire life. In a single afternoon, the routine he had clung to for years had disintegrated. Sitting across from a 3-year-old girl in a quiet corner of a small cafe, he stared down at the untouched cup of black coffee in front of him while Lily quietly sipped apple juice through a red straw. Maggie sat nearby, watchful but silent, giving them space but not quite letting go. The child, his child, was oddly calm, her small legs swinging under the table, her eyes roaming the cafe with a kind of quiet curiosity. Adrian wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that Hazel had kept such a monumental secret from him, or the fact that the little girl sitting across from him already felt familiar. He found himself studying her, not just the eyes that mirrored his own or the soft wave of her light hair, but the subtle expressions on her face, the way her lips pressed together when she was thinking, how her brow furrowed when the waitress took too long. It was eerie, like watching a reflection of emotions he'd long learned to suppress. And yet she wasn't cold or guarded, she was warm, cautious but brave, like she had seen more in her 3 short years than most adults could handle. He asked her what she liked to eat. She answered in a tiny voice, macaroni. And pancakes. But not at the same time. That made Maggie chuckle softly, and Adrian nodded, signaling to the waitress. As the food came and Lily carefully picked at her plate, he sat in silence, trying to find words. He wasn't good at this. He wasn't sure if you were supposed to talk to a child like they were fragile or like they were adults. But Lily didn't seem to need much prompting. She told him she liked clouds, music, and that Maggie sang lullabies every night even though she wasn't her real mom. She told him she used to live in a place with a piano and plants and a big window where the sun came in. And when she mentioned Hazel, just once, calling her mommy in the past tense, his breath caught. Later, when they walked out of the cafe into the cooler air, Adrian paused on the sidewalk. He looked at Maggie. I need to understand everything, he said firmly. Everything Hazel told you. I need the truth, not just fragments. Maggie nodded. I'll tell you everything I know. But not here. She handed him an envelope. This was the last letter Hazel wrote. She asked me to give it to you only if you met Lily. Back at his apartment, Adrian sat alone in his office with the letter in his hands. His penthouse, usually quiet in a way he had always appreciated, now felt oppressively silent. He could hear Maggie reading to Lily in the guest room he'd hastily prepared. The gentle murmur of voices in the distance was like an echo from a different life. He opened the letter slowly, hands trembling. Hazel's handwriting was soft, familiar. She apologized first. For disappearing, for hiding the truth, for doubting him. She told him she hadn't left because she didn't love him, she had left because she did. She was afraid he'd feel trapped, that the man who lived in a world of silence and order would see a child as a threat to that life. She wrote that she had tried to contact him once but lost her nerve. That every day, she looked into Lily's face and saw pieces of him and wondered if she'd made the right choice. And when she got sick, really sick, she realized how wrong she'd been to keep them apart. I didn't want Lily to grow up without knowing you, Hazel wrote. I didn't want her to feel unwanted, or like she was a secret. I just wanted her to be safe. And now I have to trust that you'll keep her safe. I know you don't believe in fate, Adrian, but if you're reading this, then maybe something bigger than both of us made this moment happen. Please, love her. Not because she's yours. But because she's worth it. When he finished the letter, Adrian sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his father died. Not during heartbreaks. Not when Hazel left. But now he did. Silent, restrained tears that slipped down his face as the weight of everything pressed in on him. He had lost Hazel again, this time forever. But he had been given something just as real, just as irreversible. A child. His child. He rose slowly, walked down the hall, and stopped at the doorway. Maggie looked up from the book she was reading. Lily was already half asleep, curled beneath the blanket, her small frame tucked against Maggie's side. Adrian entered quietly and knelt beside the bed. For a moment, he just watched her breathe, her face peaceful, her hand resting against her cheek. He whispered, barely audible, "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. The following morning, Adrian awoke earlier than usual, long before the sun had broken through the thick city skyline. His room was still dark, but he didn't reach for his phone or his schedule like he always did. Instead, he lay there staring at the ceiling, listening, not for silence, but for something else. And then he heard it. The faint shuffle of small feet, a quiet voice humming a tune that was unfamiliar to him, and the gentle creak of the guest room door down the hall. It wasn't noise. It was life. It was real. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel the instinct to shut it out. He rose slowly, got dressed without rushing, and stepped into a day that no longer belonged to just him. In the kitchen, Maggie was already preparing breakfast. The scent of scrambled eggs and toast filled the air, and Lily sat at the counter in a chair far too big for her, kicking her feet against a wooden stool, wearing pajamas patterned with tiny suns and clouds. When she saw him, she smiled softly but didn't say anything, just watched him with curiosity, like she was still trying to figure out what he meant in her world. He greeted her gently, unsure if he was supposed to act casual or like the moment mattered more than anything. So instead of overthinking it, he asked if she wanted orange juice, and she nodded as if they'd done this 100 times before. As Maggie set down plates in front of them, Adrian tried to ignore the strangeness of how familiar it already felt. He wasn't used to anyone else being in his space this early. His mornings were usually solitary, built around efficiency and silence. But now there was conversation, small and simple, about whether strawberries were better than bananas and if socks could be worn to bed. There were crumbs on the table, a spoon clinking against a glass, and a faint giggle when he made a face at a too sour piece of fruit. And somehow, he didn't mind any of it. After breakfast, Maggie gently pulled him aside while Lily played with her stuffed bunny near the window. Her voice was low, cautious but sincere. She told him more about Hazel's final days, how quickly her health had declined, how she'd refused to let Lily see her in the worst moments, how she had planned everything in a rush once she realized she might not survive. Adrian listened in silence, every word landing heavy in his chest. She told him Hazel had never stopped loving him, that her leaving had nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with fear, fear of breaking what they had, fear that she would become an anchor in a life she thought he never wanted changed. Maggie admitted she hadn't agreed with Hazel's choice to keep the secret, but she had respected her wishes. She said Hazel's greatest regret wasn't the illness or the struggle, it was not giving Lily and Adrian time together from the beginning. It was the days they'd missed. Adrian felt that weight settle deep inside him. He didn't know how to process the fact that 3 years of his daughter's life had already passed without him. First steps. First words. First tears. He had missed all of them. And yet, Lily didn't seem to resent him. She wasn't afraid of him. She was cautious, yes, but she looked at him like she believed he belonged in her world now. Later that day, while Maggie handled some errands, Adrian took Lily to a small bookstore nearby. It was the first time he had been out in public with her alone. People glanced at him, surprised to see the reserved, famously stoic CEO holding the hand of a toddler in pigtails. She picked out a book with sparkles on the cover and clung to it like it was treasure. At the register, she asked him, quietly, "Can you read it to me tonight?" It was such a small question, but it caught him off guard. He realized he'd never read a bedtime story before. He'd never tucked a child in. But he nodded, smiled slightly, and said, "Of course." That night, as Lily lay under soft blankets in the room that was slowly becoming hers, Adrian sat beside her and opened the glittery book. His voice was stiff at first, unused to the rhythm, but Lily didn't seem to care. She watched him with wide eyes, smiling when he gave different voices to the characters, even laughing when he tried and failed to sound like a talking bear. When he finished, she didn't ask for another story. She simply whispered, "Mommy used to read to me like that. But you do it different. I like your way too." Adrian sat with her until she fell asleep, her tiny hand resting near his arm. When he finally rose and stepped out into the hallway, he leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. This wasn't about making up for lost time. It was about starting now, with what he had. And what he had was a little girl with a bunny in one hand and a book in the other, who had accepted him into her life without asking for perfection, just presence. Just love. And Adrian was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, that was something he could give. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Adrian hadn't expected, one that felt strangely natural despite how unfamiliar it should have been. He was waking up earlier than usual, not to check emails or prepare for conference calls, but to make sure Lily had her favorite cereal and that her shoes weren't on the wrong feet. The structure he had once worshipped was now softened by unpredictability, mornings filled with scattered toys, impromptu giggles, and questions that had nothing to do with business forecasts or market trends. And instead of fighting it, he found himself leaning into it, as if a different version of himself was emerging from under layers of control he no longer needed. He began to notice the smallest things, how Lily's nose scrunched when she concentrated, the way she hummed softly when coloring, how her entire body seemed to relax when he took her hand. She was cautious with him, still unsure where he fit in her world, but she was open, never cold, and each day brought a little more trust. Adrian was learning how to be present in ways he never imagined. He found himself pausing meetings to take calls from Maggie or to video chat with Lily before her nap, and not once did he feel guilt or shame about prioritizing her over a spreadsheet. For the first time, he realized he didn't need to apologize for being human. One afternoon, while Adrian was in his office reviewing contracts, Maggie walked in quietly and handed him a folder. She had a serious look on her face, and he immediately set everything down. She explained that it was Lily's birth certificate and medical documents, records Hazel had kept safe but never shared. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught when he saw his name listed under "Father." Hazel hadn't just assumed responsibility alone, she had always known he was Lily's father, had claimed him on paper even when she couldn't reach him in person. It was her silent way of connecting them, even in absence. Inside the folder, Maggie had also placed a small envelope labeled in Hazel's handwriting. It simply read, "For Adrian, if he ever comes." Adrian stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter was short, but it was everything he needed to hear. Hazel wrote about the night she'd found out she was pregnant, how she'd stood outside his building with shaking hands, then turned away, convinced he would choose silence over love. She admitted she had been wrong, not about who he was, but about not trusting him to choose differently. She wrote about Lily's first laugh, her first word, the way she clung to the idea of her dad, even though they had never met. "She always believed you were real," Hazel wrote. "She never needed convincing. And I think, deep down, I never did either." Adrian read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and locking it in the top drawer of his desk. His hands trembled slightly, not from anger or regret, but from something deeper, a kind of reckoning. Hazel had given him a second chance. It wasn't fair that she hadn't lived to see it through, but it wasn't too late for him to honor her trust. He could still give Lily everything she needed. That night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Adrian found himself wandering into her room. He stood at the edge of her bed, watching her small frame rise and fall with each breath. A soft nightlight painted the walls in warm, shifting colors, and the bunny she always slept with was tucked under her arm. He pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, then sat in the chair across the room, unsure if he wanted to leave. He sat there for a long time, thinking about Hazel, about how his silence had once cost him so much. He had always believed control was his only strength, but it had kept him from the most important moments of his life. He didn't want that anymore. He didn't want to miss anything else. The next morning, he called his legal team. He asked them to start the paperwork for legal guardianship and adoption. He wanted his name on every document not just because it was true, but because he needed Lily to know she was wanted, chosen, not just a responsibility inherited by accident. When he told Lily that he wanted to become her real dad on paper, she tilted her head in that thoughtful way she had and asked, "But aren't you already?" He smiled at her, heart tightening, and said, "Yes. But now I want to make sure the whole world knows it too." She didn't say anything else, just reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck. Adrian held her close, feeling the weight of her small arms and the promise they represented. He knew there was still so much to learn, and that he would make mistakes, but in that moment, he stopped being afraid of it. Because she had already accepted him, flawed, uncertain, and trying. And that was more than enough to begin. Spring came softly, brushing the city with warmth and light that made everything feel new. For Adrian, the world outside had always felt distant, too fast, too loud, too uncertain, but now he noticed the way the air smelled after rain, how the trees outside Lily's window bloomed in quiet colors, and how every part of his life had slowly shifted into something he never expected. Mornings were no longer about rushing through meetings but about packing lunch boxes and brushing tangles out of Lily's hair while she chatted about her dreams. Evenings were no longer quiet but filled with questions, little giggles, messy dinners, and sometimes tears. But it didn't overwhelm him. It grounded him. It gave his life edges that felt real, even when imperfect. Lily was growing quickly, adapting in ways that amazed him. She had adjusted to her new home with a kind of graceful resilience only children seemed to possess. She filled every room with her presence, not in a disruptive way, but in a way that made everything feel warmer. Adrian had watched as she turned his cold, minimalist space into something lived in. Her art hung crookedly on the refrigerator, her stuffed animals gathered in corners of the living room, her shoes somehow always ending up under his desk. He never moved them. He liked the way they reminded him she was there, that his home was no longer just his. But no matter how well things were going on the surface, he could sense something lingering beneath Lily's calm exterior. She had adjusted, yes, but there were nights when she'd quietly retreat, sitting on the windowsill in silence, staring at the stars as if waiting for someone to speak. There were moments she'd call him Dad and moments she'd stop herself, unsure. He never pushed. He let her come to him in her own time, even though every hesitant look tugged at something deep in him. One night, after a long day, Lily asked if they could have a picnic on the floor instead of sitting at the dining table. Adrian agreed without hesitation, and they spread a blanket in the middle of the living room, eating peanut butter sandwiches and drinking apple juice from teacups. She was unusually quiet, picking at the crust of her bread. Finally, in a small voice, she asked, "If Mommy could see me now, do you think she'd be proud of me?" Adrian felt the air still between them. He reached over and gently moved her hair from her eyes. "I think," he said softly, "your mom would be so proud, Lily. Not just because you're brave or smart, but because you love so deeply. That's something she gave you, I think." Lily looked at him for a long moment before leaning into his side. She didn't say anything, and he didn't need her to. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her until her breathing slowed and her eyes grew heavy with sleep. He carried her to bed that night and stayed there until she was fully asleep, the soft rhythm of her breathing anchoring him in a way nothing else ever had. As the adoption process moved forward, Adrian found himself telling more people about Lily. His colleagues were stunned, not just by the fact that he had a daughter, but by how completely he had embraced the role. He took her to the office one afternoon, and instead of being uncomfortable in the unfamiliar space, Lily walked confidently beside him, holding his hand and waving at everyone she passed. She sat in his chair, twirling around in circles, then handed him a drawing she'd made just for his office. It was the two of them holding hands under a tree, with the words, "My Dad," written in wobbly crayon across the top. He didn't frame business awards anymore. He framed that drawing. What surprised him most wasn't how much Lily needed him, it was how much he needed her. She challenged the way he thought, broke open the guarded places inside him, made him laugh in ways he hadn't since he was a child. She made him vulnerable, and instead of fearing it, he welcomed it. One evening, after reading a story and tucking her in, Lily reached for his hand and said, "You don't have to be perfect, you know. I just like when you're here." That sentence stayed with him long after she fell asleep. For a man who had spent his life building walls, Lily was the one who taught him that love wasn't about flawless moments or grand gestures, it was about being present, being seen, and staying, even when it was hard. And Adrian had no plans to go anywhere. Adrian had never been to a courtroom for anything personal. His life, up until recently, had been filled with lawyers, contracts, boardrooms, and business disputes, all of it kept at arm's length, filtered through assistants or legal teams. But this time, he sat in a simple wooden chair, in a small family court, waiting for a judge to call his name. He wasn't a CEO here. He wasn't powerful, wealthy, or in control. He was just a man hoping to be called a father, officially, legally, without question. Lily sat beside him, her legs too short to touch the floor, her fingers curled around a small plush rabbit she had carried everywhere since the day Maggie gave it to her after Hazel's funeral. She wore a pale yellow dress that Maggie had picked out for the occasion and a quiet expression that Adrian knew meant she was thinking hard, even if she said nothing. Maggie was there too, sitting a few rows back, offering him silent support in the way she always had. She hadn't just been Hazel's friend. She had become a bridge between the past and the future, a steady presence who reminded Lily of where she came from, while helping her feel safe with where she was going. The court clerk called their names, and Adrian took Lily's hand, guiding her gently as they stood and moved toward the front. The judge was a kind-looking woman in her 50s who smiled at Lily first, then turned her gaze to Adrian with the kind of practiced, neutral warmth people in her position had mastered. She asked him a series of questions, his name, occupation, intention in adopting Lily, and he answered each one clearly, his voice steady, his resolve firm. When the judge asked Lily if she was okay with Adrian adopting her, she nodded and whispered, "I already call him Dad sometimes," and the judge smiled. A few legal steps later, it was done. Adrian Harper was, in the eyes of the law and the world, Lily's father. There was no ceremony, no music or applause, but Adrian felt something shift inside him. It was as if something that had always belonged was finally in its right place. Lily didn't fully understand the significance, but she understood enough to squeeze his hand tighter and whisper, "We're a real family now, right?" And Adrian, with a voice that cracked slightly from the weight of it all, said, "We always were." They went out for ice cream afterward, just the two of them, and sat on a bench outside the parlor watching people pass by. Lily swung her legs back and forth and asked if now that they were official, they could maybe go visit a beach sometime. She had never seen the ocean, only in books and pictures, and she wanted to build a sandcastle and find seashells. Adrian said yes without hesitation and then realized he wanted to see the ocean through her eyes more than he had ever wanted any vacation or luxury in his life. Back at home that night, they opened a small envelope that Maggie had given them earlier that morning. It was from Hazel. It had been sealed and dated 3 weeks before she passed. Inside was a photograph, an old printed picture of Hazel holding a newborn Lily in a hospital bed, both of them tired but smiling. On the back, Hazel had written a note in her familiar handwriting, "Adrian, I always knew she'd end up with you. I just wish I could have seen it." Adrian didn't speak for a long time after reading it. He just held the photograph in one hand and Lily's small hand in the other. Later that night, after she was asleep, he framed the photo and placed it on his desk next to the drawing Lily had made. It wasn't about replacing Hazel or erasing the pain of her absence, it was about carrying her memory into the new life they had built. He would never forget her, and he wouldn't let Lily forget her either. She would grow up knowing that she had been deeply loved, not just by the mother who gave her life but by the father who almost didn't know he could love at all. The next morning, Lily came into his room just after sunrise, crawling up beside him under the blankets. She didn't say anything, just tucked her head under his chin and whispered, "Good morning, Daddy." It was the first time she'd said it without hesitation. He closed his eyes and held her close, knowing without doubt that nothing in his life, not the company he built, not the wealth he acquired, not the control he used to cling to, would ever mean more than this moment. He was no longer living in a quiet world made only for himself. He was living for her. Summer arrived quietly, bringing with it golden mornings and warm evenings that stretched longer than they had any right to. Adrian found himself waking up to the sound of Lily's voice more often than an alarm clock. She would tiptoe into his room with her bunny in one hand and a new idea in the other. Sometimes it was breakfast in bed made of imaginary toast, other times it was a question about clouds or dinosaurs or why birds never seemed to get lost. He'd never imagined a life like this, but now that he had it, he couldn't imagine going back to the silence that used to define him. His world was fuller now, full of music, laughter, the occasional tantrum, and the unrelenting, beautiful chaos of being a parent. They did go to the ocean. Lily wore a sun hat too big for her head and carried a plastic pail in each hand as if her job was the most important in the world. Adrian watched her from his chair, his sleeves rolled up and sand between his fingers, and realized how much he had changed. He still checked emails, still made decisions for a company worth billions, but his time no longer belonged to business alone. It belonged to moments like these, to watching Lily chase waves and collect broken shells like treasure. She brought him one shaped like a heart and said, "This is for Mommy. I think she would like this one," and he nodded, unable to speak as he tucked it safely into his pocket. Back home, they decorated a corner of the house just for Hazel. It was Lily's idea. A small shelf with framed photos, a few of her mother's music books, and the heart-shaped shell they'd brought back from the beach. Every night before bed, Lily would say goodnight to it, whispering little thoughts or wishes. Adrian never asked what she said. It was her space, her connection, and he respected it. One evening, she turned to him and said, "I think Mommy would like you now," and he smiled, brushing her hair back from her face. "I hope so," he answered softly, knowing that all he could do was keep proving it. The adoption papers had long been signed, but the reality of their bond had taken root deeper than any legal document could reach. They celebrated their first family anniversary, in a quiet way, just the two of them baking a cake together, making a mess of the kitchen, and dancing barefoot to songs she picked. He let her choose the music even though it made no sense to him. She laughed until she couldn't breathe when he tried to twirl her and knocked over a mixing bowl. In that laughter, in that shared moment, he saw the future, imperfect, unscripted, and completely theirs. Adrian also started making changes at work. He set up a foundation in Hazel's name, one focused on supporting single parents and children dealing with grief. He didn't announce it with a press release or interviews. He just quietly directed funds, built a team, and let the work speak for itself. It felt like something that mattered in a way numbers and deals never had. He told Lily about it one night while tucking her in, and she asked if they could help other kids find their missing dads. He kissed her forehead and said, "That's the plan." As the season deepened, Lily began calling him Dad all the time. It was no longer uncertain or hesitant. It was natural. It was real. And every time she said it, Adrian felt it land in his chest like a promise. He still had hard days, still questioned himself, still feared failing her. But each bedtime hug, every morning laugh, every drawing taped crookedly on his office wall reminded him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about showing up even when you weren't sure how, about holding steady through the messy and the beautiful alike. One night, after reading her a story and turning off the light, she whispered in the dark, "Thank you for finding me." He didn't respond right away. His throat was tight, and his heart was too full. But eventually, he said, "Thank you for letting me." And as she drifted to sleep, her hand resting in his, Adrian stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her breath, knowing that this quiet, ordinary moment was the most extraordinary thing he had ever been a part of. He had spent his life chasing control, silence, and success. Now, he found peace in unpredictability, in noise, in love. And the man who once avoided every emotional risk had discovered that the greatest gift wasn't in what he had built, it was in who he had become. Not the CEO, not the millionaire, not the man who ran from connection. He was Lily's father. And in the life they now shared, that meant everything. In my opinion, the ending of this story is exactly what it needed to be: quiet, deeply emotional, and full of earned hope. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or over-the-top gestures, but instead finds its power in small, intimate moments that carry immense weight. Adrian's transformation isn't sudden or perfect, it unfolds gradually, through discomfort, grief, and love he never thought himself capable of. What makes the conclusion so beautiful is that it doesn't try to erase the pain of the past, it embraces it, learns from it, and builds something stronger in its place. Lily's presence brings out a version of Adrian that he didn't know existed, and watching him grow into that role, not because he had to but because he chose to, is incredibly moving. The story proves that family isn't just biology or legality, it's commitment, connection, and the courage to show up every single day. And in the end, Adrian isn't a hero because he's wealthy or successful, he's a hero because he becomes present, vulnerable, and willing to love fully. That, to me, is the most powerful kind of ending.